Hello, and welcome to Washtenaw Reads, recorded presentation with Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiely, the authors of All American Boys. I want to begin by thanking the libraries and their staff and the communities around those libraries all throughout Washtenaw County for the work and the many hours that was put into reading and selecting titles of books that to be used for this community event. They include the Ypsilanti area, Saline, Salem South Lyon, Northville Township, Milan, Dexter, Chelsea, and Ann Arbor. I want to say that it took a lot of courage to choose a book of this subject matter written for teens and during this period of time. It's relevant. It's incredibly important that we read this book, but choosing it for now maybe perhaps wasn't even understood to be as important as it's turned out to be. And I want to say thank you to all of them for all of that hard work. That being said, it's important to realize that we have the county essentially reading the same book about racism, police brutality, white privilege at this time in our nation's history. There could not be a more powerful or relevant moment than now. And when you listen today to Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiely speak, what you'll hear them talk about more than they talk about All American Boys is their friendship, how they met, how they learned to listen to each other, how they trust, and how that led to All American Boys. They want you to feel discomfort in this reading this novel. They intend you to, and they tell you that when they talk today, when you listen. They're unabashed about that. My hope is that we all can sit with our discomfort and come out on the other side in a place that looks like the place that Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiely have created for us, a place of trust, acknowledgement, wisdom, and listening. Thank you very much for being here, listening with all of us to Jason Reynolds and Brendan Kiely talk about All American Boys.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Reynolds. And Brendan, do you want to introduce yourself, or should I?
Yeah, sure. I'll introduce myself. I'm Brendan Kiely. Nice to see you all.
This is Brendan Kiely, and we are the authors of All American Boys. We don't have a lot of time with you, but I'm going to start just by giving you a very quick story, a true story about an event that happened to me when I was 16 years old. It was sort of a normal day in my 16-year-old life, myself and three of my friends in a car driving home from school. And the guy who's driving, my friend Karan, he is pulling up to a yellow light, and he's at that weird speed where you're going too fast, but not like over the speed, but too fast to stop at the yellow light. And so you just kind of roll through it, which is what we were all trained to do in driving school. So he rolls through the yellow light, he makes a left turn, and then we're pulled over by a police officer. And when the cop comes to the car, we unfortunately cannot find the registration because we're 16. And all of you who have been 16, you know what that feels like. All of you who are 60 know that you can never find the registration when you need it. The cop gives us a moment to look for it. And when he comes back to the vehicle and we give him the registration, he tells us to sit tight, and then he calls for backup, which was a strange situation for us. Next thing you know, 4 more cop cars pull up. A new cop comes to the window. He rolls the window down and he begins to interrogate us. He asks us if we have guns and drugs, which seemed like such a strange question to ask kids who were pulled over for running a yellow light, even though the officer said, the initial officer said we had run a red light, though we did not run a red light. We ran a yellow light, which is not illegal. The officer asks if we have guns and drugs. We, of course, say we don't have guns and drugs. If we have knives, if we have any weapons, alcohol. And of course, we don't have any of these things in the car. We're 16. We're coming from school. We're just trying to make it to the house. If anything, the only thing that we had done wrong, which is not wrong at all, is probably blast music, right? And that's not against the law either. That's just called being a teenager. The officer then asks us all to get out of the vehicle. So the 4 of us get out of the vehicle. They all ask us to get down on the ground. and they ask us to put our hands behind our backs, and then they handcuff us on the street. And then they tear my friend's car apart, and they empty out the glove compartment and tease us about some of the things that we had in there, like cologne and things that you do when you're a teenage boy. They empty out our backpacks on the street. They take everything out of the trunk. They rip up the upholstery and the flooring and all, just like going overboard, looking for what they think we have, though of course we don't have any of it. They ask us, all of our pertinent information, names, addresses, parents' names, what school, what grade, our birthdays, all these things. And of course, at the time, we don't really know what's happening, but we're just kind of going along with it because we don't want this to escalate into something else. And after about 20 minutes of this, 25 minutes of this, and after the cops have pretty much ransacked the car, the officers uncuff us and tell us to be on our way. And we get up and we clean up the mess that was made, not by us, but by these officers who pulled us over for running this yellow light. And I think about this story often because the most tragic part of it isn't the way we were treated. It's actually what happened next, which is we just cleaned up the mess. We picked up all of our things, books and notebooks and book bags and basketballs and sneakers and gym clothes and, all the things that were in that car. We got back in the vehicle, closed the door, turned the music back up and drove on. And we never told anybody about it, and we never even talked about it. At this point, it's been 20 years. It's been about 20 years exactly, actually, since that happened. And I told my mom for the first time when All American Boys came out, which would have been, 5 years ago, right? That was the first time I ever told my mother about that moment. And people always ask, well, why didn't you tell your mom? Why didn't you tell anybody? And that question is a funny question for a kid like me, just because what was there to tell her? That Tuesday was Tuesday, right? We had grown up watching this happen. We'd seen our friends get slammed on the hoods of cars. We'd watched our family members get their teeth kicked in. This wasn't something that seemed abnormal to us. As a matter of fact, it seemed so normal that it wasn't even worth discussing. So when it comes to the character that I wrote about, Rashad Butler in All American Boys, what I really wanted to discuss, even more than the physical injury and the physical abuse, is the psychological injury that lives in the body of so many of us who have experienced the abuse of power at the hands of the police.
And, I listened to Jason tell his story, and I think about my own experience growing up and my own experiences with police officers in particular. And as Jason said, the experiences of his own life help inform how he wrote Rashad's half of All American Boys. And All American Boys is a dual narrative. It's Rashad's story, and it's also Quinn's story. And the experiences of my life influenced the way that I wrote Quinn's half of the book. And, in kind of contrast to the story that Jason just told you, there were plenty of times that when I was a teenager, I had run-ins with police officers. And one time in particular that sticks out in my mind and I think is relevant to share with you all, is a time that I really was breaking the law. And I was driving a minivan full of white boys like me, and I'm cruising down the highway, and I'm going 85 miles an hour in a 55-mile zone. And again, I know there are a lot of people of a variety of ages who are watching this, and I'm not sharing the story to brag or to boast at all. It was dumb, it was dangerous, and more to the point, it was illegal. And for everybody who's watching who, has their license, if you're going 30 miles over the speed limit, you're not just speeding, it's also reckless driving. So I'm endangering lives. And as I'm cruising down the highway, when the police car pulls up behind me and the lights flash, I think a lot about how for many of my friends who are Black or Indigenous or people of color, they often have been given a talk when they're growing up about what to do when that police officer pulls up behind you. But when I was growing up as a white boy, nobody gave me a talk. And I think that's important to share with you, because when that police car pulled out behind me, I was nervous, but I'm not nervous for my life in the same way that many, many, many people in our country are. So what do? I'm nervous. Obviously, I just got caught doing something I know I'm not supposed to do. I floor it. I keep tearing down the highway, high speed chase. police cars chasing after me. My friends are yelling at me, Brendan, pull over, pull over. I pull over. I pull into a parking lot, actually, on the side of the highway, and the police car pulls up beside me. The officer asks for license and registration. Dig it out, I give it to him. Eventually, he asked me to get out of the car. He asked me if I'd been drinking alcohol or smoking marijuana, and of course, I hadn't been doing any of that. But he asked, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And I went into a sob story because I could. I told the police officer that I was, we're just trying to play mini golf, and then we're supposed to go get ice cream and this and that and the other thing. But all I really wanted to do was go home, go home, go home. And here I am, this, teenager who's nervous and scared and knows he did something wrong. And, my knees are knocking. And the officer immediately took pity on me. He had compassion for me. And in fact, it's what the officer said to me, because where the story's going. Obviously, I did not get a ticket. I did not even get a written warning, right? But it's what the police officer said to me that's really sticks with me and helps inform why I want to write Quinn's side of All American Boys. Because he said, go home, be safe, and keep your friends safe. And I think about that every single time we have to talk about All American Boys. I think about that because it's like a little fish hook in my gut that just tugs and tugs and tugs to remind me what it means to have white privilege in America. It's not like a political statement to talk about white privilege. Actually, another way of talking about it might just be living white, because the existence of my living white is one in which I continually live with privilege every day. The idea isn't about whether or not I should have gotten the ticket or what, but that the police officer looked at me and immediately assumed that I was one of those kids who deserved a second chance, that I was one of those kids who was doing something wrong, but if he was scolded appropriately, he wouldn't do it again. And the officer's right. I never made that mistake again. I did not want to endanger lives, and I'm grateful for his compassion and his pity. But that's the kind of privilege that someone like me all too often has when so many others don't. It's a statistical reality in New York City, for example, in the years 2005 to 2009, when stop and frisk was common practice for the NYPD, 80% of the people who were stopped were Black and Latinx. 80%. Only 10% were white. In the 1.6 million stops that are accounted for in that time, only 2.6 of those people who were stopped were actually found carrying contraband or a weapon. 2.6%, right? And guess what? More of that 2.6% were white people, not the Black or Latinx people who were stopped disproportionately, 80% to the 10% of white people. That's the statistical reality of living with white privilege, right? So it's not a political statement, and our book isn't a political book. It's an expression of the reality of our lives, right? And so this is the kind of stuff that Jason and I were talking about, actually, as we met each other. And Jason, I don't know if you want to give some more background about that, because those are stories that inform why we wrote Rashad and Quinn, but I don't know if you want to talk more about how we met her and the context of that time period, especially as it relates to today.
Sure. I mean, we met in 2014. The publishers put us on the road together. Both of us had written our debut novels. Brendan had written The Gospel of Winter, and I had written When I Was the Greatest. And, publishers get creative, when they have these books that they're like, man, we got to figure out how to make these things go, right? And these debut guys, these new jacks. And so they put us on the road together. Which typically wouldn't have been a problem, except for the fact that 2014 was a feverish year. It was a year where the streets ran red with blood, right? We're talking about the year that Black Lives Matter began. We're talking about Michael Brown. We're talking about the end of the Trayvon Martin case. We're talking about Eric Garner and Freddie Gray. And I mean, this is a rough year, right? Tamir Rice is happening around this time. All Rakia Boyd, right? Lots of things are going on sort of within, like in the zeitgeist, where me and Brendan have met and are traveling together as strangers, as people who do not know one another. And, for all the adults out there, there are these rules that we abide by. There's a social contract that all of us tend to uphold that says that when you first meet people, you don't ever speak about religion or politics, right? Because that's the fastest way to lose a friend before you make one. And so we're following the rules, even though I just want to talk about politics because my mom's calling me and she's angry every night and she wants to know when it's going to end, when, 60 at the time, 65, 70 years of living as an American, as a Black American, and the exhaustion and the frustration in her voice is something I'll never forget. And eventually it came up in conversation after Brendan and I experienced a wild moment of insensitivity and racism at a Mexican restaurant, at a Tex-Mex restaurant in Texas. And we get back to the hotel and we start to have this discussion. And it's a watershed moment, right? Because now I have my end, right? I have my opening and I can't hold it back anymore. And so, I'm an emotional person and I'm a whole person, one that is human and tries to own that humanity. I don't pretend to not feel, right? And so I let it all out and I told him how I felt. I told him my own experiences and I banged the table and I cried and I just told him what was balled up in me for such an extended period of time while being on the road with a person that I didn't feel like I could talk to about it. And in that moment, Brendan extended to me quite a gift. And it was simply the gift of silence, right? And not just silence as in dismissal, silence as in, active listening, the kind of silence that can only come with a person who's actually trying to hear what you have to say. I don't know if I'd ever had that experience from a white person, let alone a white man. And it felt like a treasure, not because he's a treasure, he is, but at the time it wasn't that. It was because now I felt like I could trust somebody with this pain, and just maybe this person could be someone that I could be vulnerable around when it comes to conversations around race, and who's not going to try to explain it away or shoot me statistics or say not me, I'm different, not all of us, all the things that we use to sort of diffuse really important conversations that need to be had. And so that was the beginning of the relationship. And we always like to make sure people know All American Boys is a book about teenagers. Yes. It's a book that talks about a very complicated situation as far as police violence. Yes. But really what All American Boys is about is the friendship between Brendan and I. It's a physical manifestation of the friendship we built on that particular day.
And I appreciate that story that Jason shared because A, I love this man, and B, I don't take for granted that degree of trust. As a white person who's been granted some trust in a conversation about race and racism and white privilege, and I think that's part of the spirit of the book, is that if you can find a way to begin to really listen, for folks who maybe either thought they were listening before but haven't been maybe listening enough, or for folks who are learning how to survive and thrive in the face of all of this racism, that there are people within their own community to listen to. I think there is a real heartbeat in the book about listening and what it means to really listen. And one story to sort of bring that home to you is I remember speaking with a student, a high school student in Maine, who had read All American Boys. And I was speaking at the school. She was a Black student in a school that was 90% white. And she asked one of the most profound questions I've ever been asked. And it was really hard to answer, but I think a community that's reading this book and having this kind of deep questioning maybe will be part of the answer to the question itself. But the question was, when white students are the majority minority in high schools across America, which, by the way, will be the reality in 2023, that in all K through 12 public schools in America, white people will for the first time be the majority minority. There'll be more students of color in K through 12 schools across the country. But she said, when white people are the majority minority, will they finally have the empathy that I've been asking for in all of my stories? That's a profound question. And my hope is that a book like All American Boys asks us, what are the steps we need to take to begin to have some of that empathy? Those of us who are white, certainly, to begin to build that bridge to a place that we should have been a long time ago. Because we obviously didn't have, as a community, enough empathy when Emmett Till was murdered. We obviously didn't have enough empathy when Rodney King was brutalized. We obviously didn't have enough empathy when Michael Brown was killed. And I'm still wondering how much empathy we need to build and bridge after someone like George Floyd has been killed. All those years are connected. So when we published All American Boys, it was just like in the 50s or just like today.
Do you want to talk a bit? I'm sure there'll be people, Michiganders. I love to say Michiganders, man. I'm sure there'll be Michiganders who want to know what makes you, like, what exactly is the makeup of Brendan Kiely, right? Because to a lot of people, look, to a lot of Black people, we just can't believe it. You know, I mean, you and I have a lot of mutual friends, and you're beloved by a lot of us, even though I know you like to shirk that off because you don't want to see yourself as exceptional. And we don't see you as exceptional, because it's dangerous to do so. But we do, a lot of us do feel very safe, right? And so my question is, what exactly, like, what's the ingredients, not of being sort of someone like Brendan Kiely, but of Brendan Kiely?
I'm going to step outside myself to answer that question.
Well, you know what you've experienced. You have your own experiential truths.
Absolutely. But I think the way to answer your question in as honest a way as I can is to think about all the times where I wanted to say as a white person, but it's not me. It was other folks over there, or it was white folks in history, or it was, a problem that happened somewhere else, or it's not me. Or when hearing these stories, wanting to think of oneself as an individual separate from other individuals who are committing acts of violence, atrocity, racism. And I think part of the real bridge that has to be built is for white folks to begin to recognize how they are part of a collective, are part of a group. And as a group, we have an enormous amount of responsibility for the creation of racism in our country, whose legacy exists today. And again, it's not a political statement. It's not you can read the documents, the historical documents. It's there. But when you talk about our founding documents saying something to the effect of, this is not a quote, but it's the reality of what it delivered, that human beings were to be labeled as 3/5 of a human being, counted as 3/5 of a human being. That reality still exists today. White folks like us, when we make assumptions, when we walk into a room of who's the person in charge, who's the judge in this room right now, who's the CEO in this room right now, we perpetuate the legacy that was given to us. And I think if we begin to consider ourselves as more of a collective, to answer your question, I think that we may be able to really recognize that we collectively have a responsibility that we have to really deal with. And I guess I kind of want to throw, maybe as a way to kind of wrap up our introduction, throw a question back at you, because I wonder if, with regards to All American Boys, since so often we see when we're having these conversations, and even the examples that I brought up, and it's, I'm just as guilty of this. We always talk about death, but in All American Boys, you specifically didn't want to talk about death. You wanted to talk about something else. And I think for folks of color who are reading this book in the community, I think it's important maybe to hear about that too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think to write a child who dies, I find to be becoming I find it to be an easy route, which is a terrible thing to say, but as a creator of goods, to write a dead child sometimes is a catalyst for sale, which is a complicated thing to reckon with. Because what it also does is that it buys in not only to stereotype and to a false sympathy, it almost begs for sympathy for that matter. But what it also does is that it decides to shine light on a very small percentage of people who are affected by such a tremendous issue in our country. Don't get me wrong, this is no disrespect to those who have died. We wrote these books with those human beings in mind, right? But the truth of the matter is that police brutality and police violence, it usually does not end in death, but it does not make it any less traumatic. If you ask a Black person what the trauma feels like, ask them to explain to you what happens in their bodies in the 15 seconds it takes for a police officer to get from the cruiser to their car. Ask them what it feels like inside their bodies as they're waiting for the cop to approach the vehicle. And then you'll see what trauma really feels like, right? The psychological injury that one must carry for the rest of it. That happened 20 years ago, and yet it's fresh every single time I hear a siren. In my body, like a lightning bolt up my spine, every single time I see an officer approach me 20 years later. And so I wanted to, one, write a child who survives, who lives, and who will go on to live, right? And two, I wanted to write about psychological injury, because we don't talk about psychological injury as it pertains, because those people aren't made hashtags, right? Those people, we made Rashad a hashtag in the book. We created that sort of moment in the book, but that this is fiction, because in real life, the people who survive, the people who are beaten almost to death but live, usually aren't written about or aren't talked about. We have a few moments, right? Look, if you want to see the I don't want to say the greatest, but if you want to see one of the most painful examples of how this plays out, all you have to do is study Rodney King, right? He was beaten almost to death but lived, but he never really lived again. And that is the truth behind what I wanted to show, and to see him make choices, to see him be afraid of protest, because there's this idea that all the Black people and brown people are like ready to fight and go out into the street. And it's like, no, a lot of us have been afraid. A lot of us are terrified. A lot of us have been terrified. That ain't a new thing. Everybody believes that every Black person on earth was at the March on Washington. Incorrect. There were a lot of Black people who were terrified to go out there and march with Dr. King, right? That is not a new thing. And you know why? We are afraid because turns out Black people are human beings. Fear is a natural emotion. It exists even in the face of grand oppression, right? Like, if not more so in the face of grand oppression. And I wanted to make a whole person, not just a blip that turned into a symbol that we can then write a book around. I wanted that person to have say and heart and spirit, right? All of those things are important because that's who we actually are. There are people in your classrooms who are those who are Rashad Butlers, in your churches, on your block, right? And I think it's important that we recognize them as well.
I think that's really, I just want to add one last thing, because I think it's important to share, because people want to know about who are Rashad and Quinn today.
Yeah,
they're all of you.
Yeah.
Jason's talking about human beings. And I think it's important to think about, well, what are we doing? These are the questions we should be asking ourselves. And I think that's one reason why we always say this is not an anti-police book at all.
No.
We have police officers in our families. We love, our family members. There's no doubt about it. But it's an anti-police brutality book. And I feel like we should all be anti-police brutality. We should all be anti-oppression, and we should be anti-racist. And I appreciate when Jason talks about this book being about human beings.
Yeah.
Because I think that's who we should be talking about.
And I hope that's what you all are talking about, right? As we close out, I really hope that as you all read the book together, which is important to do, by the way, and we're humbled and we're honored that you all are going to read this together. But I do want you to remember that we're talking about human beings. and that you don't have to know the person to love them, right? If you are a human and another human is being mistreated, the human part of you should activate, right? Like, we shouldn't have to teach empathy. It should be woven into who you are because we happen to all be human. And so we really want this to be a human moment for you all. Don't be afraid to engage. Don't be afraid of the words like black and white. Everybody gets all scared and, oh God, white people, white privilege. You hear these words and everybody starts to recoil. Push back against your own fear and your own insecurity and your own guilt and shame, and lean into a conversation that could make the environment around you a bit more safe and a bit more equitable. Invite police officers in too. It is very important to involve them in this conversation. And to hear what they have to say, and to make sure that they listen to what you have to say. They are public servants, right? It is important that they hear what you have to say as well. We wish you peace. We wish you understanding, a whole lot of humility and listening. And more so, I mean, I hope that y'all get to build some dope friendships like we've been able to do in the midst of such a complicated conversation.